Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Baruch haba, Rabbi Yehoshua Grunstein. Well, I had the privilege to speak on so many occasions with our guest speaker, Rabbi Yehoshua Grunstein, and who is from Strauss Amiel, the director of training and placement of rabbis and shlichim all over the world, in the diaspora. And I mentioned that when we had a representative of the Amiel in the previous program, but now that you are here, Rabbi Yehoshua, I want to say to you a great Yishar Koach for helping the Durban, not only on one occasion, but on few occasions. You were always there to assist me, and we had an excellent duch through you. You've been a very good shadchan, and with Itamar and Tagel, the Rabbi Greenblum and his wife that have been with us. So we thank you for that. In the past, I said that please God, the day will come that you will come and visit. So if not in person, at least through the Zoom, we will have the privilege to have you with us. And I was thinking, Parashat HaShavua, Lech Lecha, we speak about Abraham, that his name was Avram, and it was changed to Abraham. And when it was Avram, he was the father of Aram. He was limited to a nation. He was the spiritual leader of a nation. Hashem said to him, Abraham, Av Hamon Goim, I'm going to make you now in charge of many nations. And as we know, Abraham spread his faith not only among the Jewish people, but among everywhere and around the whole world. And in a way, what this organization is doing is also Abraham. They're sending shlichim from all over the world and the diaspora, which we need them so much, especially in these days. So this is a great mitzvah and a great achievement, and we thank you for that. And with these few words, I will ask you, Rabbi Yehoshua, to address us. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Rabbi Zakari, and thank you very much, Rabbi Friedman. And with permission from my dear student, Rabbi Greenblum, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. Indeed, when I was in touch regarding the shidduch of Rabbi Greenblum and his wife Tagil with the community, indeed, I said to the rabbi that I do hope that I'll have the privilege of coming to the community and seeing one of our graduates, and in this case, two of our graduates actually functioning in the community full time. And I have to admit, Rabbi, you delivered. Here I am, though there is a screen between us. And I hope that one day the screen won't be between us and we'll be able to see each other in person. And of course, see all the various community workers in full force and working hard. I'm sure they're working hard now, but unfortunately, COVID-19 has indeed necessitated us to work a little differently than usual. So I hope that that day will come sooner than later. It's really a pleasure to be with you this evening. And with permission from the rabbis, I'd be happy to begin. I was asked this evening by Rabbi Greenblum to share with you an idea, one idea. And that's an idea that I was privileged to put out in 2018 when I put out my second book called Beyond Routine, whose cover is on the screen right now. This particular book has nothing to say other than this, and that is that every time we do any mitzvah, any commandment of God, there's both the physical action and there's supposed to be a residue, a smell, a scent that stays on us above and beyond the time that we did the mitzvah. It's very much like when you cut onions. I don't know how many cut onions, but I know that when I cut onions, the residue stands in my hand for about 2 hours later, even though I wash them and I dry them and I do everything. When you cut onions, usually the residue stays there. And my question is, if during the time that we do a mitzvah, be it when we shake a lulav, when we light the Hanukkah candles, when we eat the matzah, is it just about the physical action of when we do it and that's it? Or is there supposed to be a residue, something left over above and beyond the time that we did that mitzvah. And that's what I attempted to show in this book. And what I'm going to share with you this evening is, of course, not in the book, because if you want to see what's in the book, you're welcome to get it. But I am the worst businessman alive. I make shidduchim between rabbis and communities, as the rabbi pointed out, but when it comes to business, I don't know what I'm doing. My entire book is based on lectures online, which of course you can access. And what I'm about to tell you now is something that I've also spoken about. So don't feel obligated to buy the book, but just in case you want to, I didn't want this evening to repeat what's in there. So I'm going to share something that's not in there. So if you bear with me, let's begin. As you can see here on the screen, there's a theory and there's a practice. In theory, indeed, we're supposed to have these two boxes in front of us every time we do one of God's commandments. If you look on your right, you'll see that it says in the departing sermon of our great teacher Moshe, Vayikra Moshe el Kol Yisrael, and Moshe called all the Jewish people and told them that I am about to tell you the mitzvot, the authority of commandments that you need to do. V'limadetem otam ushmartem lasotam, and you shall learn them and you shall fulfill them. So first and foremost, we have to learn what God wants of us and do it. So we have to see that it says in the Torah to put on tefillin, and we put on tefillin. We have to see that it says in the Torah to eat matzah, and that's what we do. However, if you look on the left side of your screen, you'll see that in the Code of Jewish Law, which is supposed to be a book all about what we're supposed to do, not what we're supposed to think, but what we're supposed to do, says the Ramah, the Code of Jewish Law for the Ashkenazim, Rav Moshe Isserlish, who functioned in the 16th century together with the Shulchan Aruch, with the Code of Jewish Law. And he writes, Gam b'hatznei alechet, u'v'shochbo mishkavo, even when no one's looking, and even when you lay down at night, one should know before who one slumbers. And when one awakes immediately, he or she should get up quickly to serve his or her creator. So says the Ramah, in his Code of Jewish Law, at the opening chapter of it, it's not just about what we do, but it's about what we feel. It's not just about how we are going to implement what the Torah says with our hands or with our mouth, but rather it's also about what we're supposed to feel. That being the case, I would have imagined that that would be in every mitzvah. But in practice, that's not exactly what happens. Because if you look on my left, you'll see that the prophet Yeshayahu says, Vayan Hashem, and God said, Yan, hinigasha amazeh, these people came close to me, befiv ubispatav kibduni, with their mouth, and even with their words, they've respected me, belibo rachak mimeni. But unfortunately, their heart was far from me. Now, what does that basically mean? That basically means something that I've learned in my travels around the world, including in South Africa. I've never been to Durban, so you can correct me if Durban's different. But in many, many places in the world, and I don't think that Durban is any different, many people greet you with a smile. Before COVID-19, we had a smile, we said good morning and good evening, and it's a wonderful thing. However, the question is, do we really mean it? After all, I can smile. It doesn't mean that I actually like the person in front of me. I'm just being polite. Now, that's fine between human beings. But when it comes to our service of God, God says, with due respect, I know what's in your heart. So you're going to go ahead and daven, pray. You're going to go ahead and say the entire Haggadah on the night of Pesach. But if your heart's not there, I'm going to know it. And therefore, he says, tell the Jewish people, and this is what Yeshayahu repeats, Befiv uvispatav kibduni, belibo rachak mimeni. Their mouth is there, the words are there, their heart's not there. Their heart's in a different place. However, that's not the way it's supposed to be. Because not only does God come and say, tell the Jewish people, I know that it's not complete, but this is in essence why we probably make a bracha before we do a mitzvah. As everybody knows, there's no obligation whatsoever to make a bracha on a biblical level. In other words, if and when you eat matzah, or you put on tefillin, or you light the Shabbos candles, or the Hanukkah candles. If you just do the mitzvah, you've done the act. The sages came along and enacted that we actually say a blessing prior to doing the mitzvah. And usually it follows the formula on the right side of your sheet. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. Blessed be you, God, King of the universe. Asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav. You have sanctified us with your commandments. Explains the Ritva. The Ritva was a medieval scholar who wrote an interpretation on the Talmud. And the Ritva says, why do we say this bracha before doing a mitzvah? And I'm reading it now in the English. The reason our sages instituting saying a bracha right before the mitzvah is because the blessings are the work of the soul. And it's preferable to give priority to spiritual before the physical. In other words, before we do a mitzvah, we have to say we are about to be sanctified, influenced by this mitzvah. And therefore we say a blessing prior in order for that influence to come. So it won't just be a physical act, but one that's spiritual as well. So in practice, I believe that many, many of us can say once a year on Yom Kippur, God, we have done what you have asked. We did this mitzvah and that mitzvah. We stayed away from this prohibition or that one. But how many of us can come before God and said, God, we also allowed the mitzvah to sanctify us. Just like we said before we did the mitzvah, Asher Kidishanu, you have sanctified us in your commandments. And therefore, I believe it's extremely important to talk about it and to talk about it from time to time. So most of our time is how to do a mitzvah. Most of our time is spent on what to do. But here and there, we have to ask ourselves, how did it influence me? And the one that, in my opinion, said it so succinctly was the gentleman whose picture's on your screen, Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik functioned between 1903 to 1993, probably gave ordination to more rabbis in the history of Jewish people. The majority of modern Orthodox rabbis in America got their smicha, their ordination, from Rav Soloveitchik. And he famously said, Lo rak musar shel ha'pe'ula mekayem et ha'halacha, ela af musar shel ha'hargasha. Or in the English, it's not just the morality of actions, but also a morality of feeling. And if you look at the next screen, he vividly says what he means in the following words. In 1968, I believe, everybody hear me? Okay. In 1968, his mother-in-law, the Talner Rebbitzin, passed away. And he gave a eulogy for this woman. And he decided to talk about what is the difference between the education of a father and the education of a mother. Now, you may be looking at this and saying, in our house, actually the feminine side does this and the masculine side does that. And that's probably fine and there's no problem. But both of these things should be part of our educational system. Says Rav Soloveitchik, we have two masorot, two traditions. He talks about his father. Father, whose picture's on the screen, teaches the son the discipline of thought as well as the discipline of action. Father's tradition is an intellectual, moral one. Says Rav Soloveitchik, the father teaches you how on Friday night you're supposed to take a cup of wine, fill it up to the top, lift it about 24 centimeters above the table, say the following words, and drink it. That's called Kiddush. But what does a mother teach? Or in his case, what did his mother, whose picture's on the screen, what did she teach? She died about a year prior. I quote, most of all, I learned from my mother that Judaism expresses itself not only in formal compliance with the law, but also as a living experience. She taught me that there's a flavor, a scent, and a warmth to the mitzvah. Or as my own teacher, Rav Rakefet, quotes in his Rebbe, Rav Soloveitchik's name, my mother taught me how to live Judaism and not just practice it. So as you could see, throughout our tradition, going all the way back to Moshe and eventually to the 20th century to Rav Soloveitchik, we have in everything we do two aspects. One is what the hands and the feet and the mouth are supposed to do physically. And the other is, how do we change it and make it into a living experience so it influences us? And those two things have to be in every mitzvah we do. Now, obviously, if you just do the mitzvah and you don't feel anything, I believe it's an amazing achievement. How many Jews around the world could say that they do all the mitzvot? I know I can't say it. So it's an amazing achievement. However, if indeed we take our observance of Jewish law seriously, I hope we also have a discussion of not just what we have to do, but how did it influence me and us and our community and the people around us. So instead of me just talking about it, let's see a few examples to try to vividly go ahead and show you what I mean. When I give a class, I always tell my students that I'm pretty sure at this point, Rabbi Greenblum knows this. He's probably looking at me and saying, Rabbi, you just made this up. You know, it's easy. Take sources from here, take sources from there, make up an argument and prove your case. So I always like to prove my case from Jewish law itself. I don't like to prove my case just from philosophy, just from what I think, but rather let's take two examples that we all do and see if these two aspects are there or not. So let's start with the first example right away. The first example is tefillin. Many of us go to shul every morning and we put on both the talis and the tefillin. Lately, I'm sure many of you have been going and putting on the talis, the tefillin, and the mask. Now, talis and tefillin is a daily mitzvah. Tefillin is the more important one for me because even if you don't wear a talis, it's okay. It's a mitzvah, but it's not obligatory to force yourself. But tefillin is obligatory. So says the code of Jewish law. How are you supposed to put on tefillin? We all know we're supposed to put it on our hand, on our arm, and on our head. Says the code of Jewish law. Yechaben b'hanachatam, shetzibanu HaKadosh Baruch Hu lahaniach al hazroa keneged halev, al harosh keneged hamoach. So instead of the code of Jewish law telling us that we're just supposed to put tefillin on our hand and on our head, he says the tefillin are supposed to be right next to your heart and on your head to correspond the brain, to correspond what you're thinking. So says the code of Jewish law that the mitzvah is not just to put tefillin on your hand and on your head, but it's supposed to be something that you put on every morning and influences both your head and your heart. Both your head and your heart. Namely, both what you think, which would dictate what you're supposed to do, namely saying hello, saying goodbye, driving safely, treating all your workers with respect, treating your wife, your children, your husband, your children, your grandchildren with respect. That's what the brain tells us to do. But also the heart should be influenced. You have to allow it to influence you, just like any other thing should influence you. And therefore, the code of Jewish law, instead of just saying hand, heart, goes ahead and says, this is what you should do. And then he goes ahead and emphasizes it, that when you put on the tefillin on your hand, one should ensure that his tefillin is moved a bit to the side on the arm, so that when one moves his arm, it's going to rub against your heart. So in every single morning, except for Shabbat and the holidays, when we put on tefillin, it's supposed to influence not just our brain, which will dictate what we do, but rather our heart, which would dictate what we feel. And this is done every morning, and therefore, says the code of Jewish law, in the Torah, it doesn't say hand, heart only, but rather it also says, as we say in the Shema, Ukshartam le'ota yadecha v'hayu letotafot bein einecha. In the Shema, it says hand and heart, but in other places it says that it's supposed to be al levavecha, namely next to the heart and on the head, symbolizing both the hand and the heart, namely symbolizing both what we do with our hand, which is dictated by our brain, and what we feel. Example number 2. And this example, I'm sure, you've all experienced in some way or another. In Durban, just remind me, are you back in shul or you're still davening somehow Zoom or whatnot?
Back in shul.
Back in shul, wonderful. So if you're back in shul, I'm sure you've resumed laning, reading the Torah. And I have to admit that laning is one of the most strangest things that I believe we have in our tradition. Why do I say it's the strangest thing we have? Because many a community that approaches us and asks for rabbis, their first and foremost concern is, does he know how to lane? Because a sermon, many people can do. Even being a chazan, many people can do. As you all know, the chazan and the rabbi always have a debate. Who works harder? So the chazan says, I work harder. The rabbi gives a sermon for 10 minutes, 5 minutes. I'm the chazan. I have to be up there for about 2 hours. The rabbi says to the chazan, well, indeed, quantity-wise, you work harder. You're up there for 2 hours, I'm for 10 minutes. But let's remember, Mr. Chazan, I have to change what I say every week. You have the same text all the time. So indeed, laning is difficult because every week it changes. Sometimes in the same week it changes from one day to another. If there's a Rosh Chodesh, if there's a holiday in the middle of the week. To make a long story short, when it comes to laning, I would like to suggest that there's 2 things we're doing. Number 1, we're learning Torah. Says the Gemara, Miyamot Moshe v'ad Rabban Gamliel, lo ayu lemedim Torah ela me'umad. From the time Moshe Rabbeinu brought the Torah down on Shavuot at Mount Sinai, until the times of Rabban Gamliel, they would only read the Torah standing up. But Mishemet Rabban Gamliel, once Rabban Gamliel died, Yarat Choli La'olam, v'ayu lemedim Torah miyushav. Since Rabban Gamliel came on the scene, we're more sensitive, and therefore, I am sure you are all sitting down, and I can promise you, I'm sitting down. And we're learning Torah together. Thus says the Code of Jewish Law, Rav Yosef Karo, when he codified Jewish law, Ein tzarich la'amod me'umad be'et shekorin b'Torah. There's no obligation to stand up when you read the Torah. So if you've been in shul on Shabbat or you'll be in shul tomorrow morning, Monday, you know there's no obligation to stand up if you're not reading the Torah. And indeed, if you have a custom to stand, it's a custom. And even those that say it's a good idea to stand have to admit it's not an obligation. However, if the story would end here, then all Torah reading is about is learning Torah. And if it was about learning Torah, then I beg the question, isn't it easier to learn Torah in English? Isn't it easier to learn Torah the way we're doing it now? Do you really believe that the way we go ahead and learn the Torah is the best way to teach? I mean, imagine if I came to this class and I say, hi, Rabbi Friedman, and God said to Moshe saying, go up and go down, go here and go there. You'd say, Rabbi, why are you singing? Rabbi, what's the sing song all about? And why in Hebrew? No one understands it. If it was about learning Torah only, we'd probably do it in the vernacular, in English, and we'd probably not sing-song it, and we'd probably face the congregation. We'd do many things differently. And therefore, I'd like to suggest that laning is not just about learning Torah, but it's about something else. And if you look at the next screen, you'll see 2 very interesting Gemaras from our Talmud about laning. One in the Babylonian Talmud and one in the Jerusalem Talmud. Let's start with the top source. Babylonian Talmud. HaKoret HaMegillah Omed V'Yoshev. You can read the Megillah on Purim, standing or sitting. You can read the Megillah standing or sitting. Comes along the Gemara and says, Mashe ein kain b'Torah. But when you lane, namely, Rashi explains, she'ein korim b'Torah b'tzibur miyushav. If you're the laner, you're supposed to be standing up and not sitting down. And I'm sure in your shul, correct me if I'm wrong, Rabbi, the gentleman who lanes the Torah does it standing up, correct? So, Gemara number 1. Gemara number 2, Jerusalem Talmud. Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak ayel liknishta. Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak went to shul. And at that time, there was a gentleman that used to interpret Torah reading simultaneously. They would read a verse, and then there would be an interpretation in the vernacular. So this is what happened. Let's just say that the rabbi was reading the Torah and Rabbi Friedman was going to translate. So the rabbi read 3-4 verses and it took him a while. So what did Rabbi Friedman do? He leaned his hand on the bima because it's boring and he's going to fall down if he doesn't. Comes the Gemara and says, Asur lecha, you can't lean. Shem shenitna be'ema v'yira, kach anu tzarchim linhog ba be'ema v'yira. You can't lean during laning. Excuse the tongue twister. Why can't you lean during laning? Because just like the Torah was given with great trepidation at Sinai, so too when we lane, we have to do it with great trepidation. And I'm pretty sure at Mount Sinai, no one came along and started to lean and said, oh God, what do you got to say? Oh, there's thunder, there's lightning, there's shofar blowing. Oh, that's nice. I'm just going to lean on the wall here and take it easy. Since you were very much with trepidation, then that's the way it should be during laning. The Gemara goes on that Rav Chagai and Rav Shmuel, son of Yitzchak, went to shul. And once again, Chama was interpreting the Torah reading, but without another reader there. So you had one person laning and translating. They said to him, that's forbidden. Just like the Torah was given by virtue of a messenger, so too we have to act. In other words, when we lane, there's always two people at the bima. One is the reader of the Torah, who I would say, Yachol, is in place of God giving the Torah. And one is the gentleman getting the aliyah, or the gabbai, who's in place of Moshe, who received the Torah. Based on these sources, you're supposed to stand. You can't lean. And number 3, you have to have a giver and a receiver. I'd like to suggest that the Torah reading is not just about learning Torah, but it's about creating an experience like the one at Sinai. If you look at the next page, you'll see that I brought sources from 3 different people who basically say this as law, not as suggestion, but as law. The Rambam, the person translating cannot lean, as we just saw, but has to stand there with trepidation, just like we did at Sinai. Source number 2, the Code of Jewish Law, Rav Yosef Karo, whose alleged picture is here on the right. Im shliach tzibor rotze levarech la'atzmo velikrot, tzarich acher shi'amod etzlo. If indeed you have a laner who gets an aliyah. During COVID-19, in many places they were very nervous that too many people touched the Torah. So I'm not so sure why, because in the minyan that we've been davening in a parking lot outside, we have aquagel, and every person getting an aliyah puts it on before and after. But in many places they were nervous, so they had one person get all the aliyahs, and he was the laner, the person that read the Torah. So says the Code of Jewish Law, if that's the case, then tzarich sheyamod acher etzlo. Someone else has to stand there with the laner. And the reason? Because geshem shenitna Torah al yedei sarsur, kach anu tzarchim linhog ba al yedei sarsur. Just like the Torah was given by a messenger, so too there needs to be someone there as the receiver. So Moshe received the Torah from God. Every time we lane, we have to reenact the experience of receiving the Torah then. So we don't lean, we stand upright, and there has to be at least 2 people at the bima. A giver of the Torah, standing in place of God, the gentleman who's reading, and the receiver, the gentleman who usually gets the aliyah. And if there's no one to get the aliyah, then someone else has to stand there just like that, because you need to have at least 2 people. Thus, says the Chafetz Chaim. His real name wasn't Chafetz Chaim. His mom didn't tell him, time for dinner, Chafetz Chaim, and clean your room. His real name was Rav Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan. He died in 1933. He wrote the Mishnah Brura, which is an interpretation on the Code of Jewish Law. The picture on the bottom of the screen is a real picture of him. It was taken from a video. It was taken from a video in 1923, 10 years before he died. And I cut it for you here. because of all the pictures on the screen. The Rambam is an alleged picture, so is Rabbi Yosef Karo, but the Chafetz Chaim is a real picture. And it says in the Mishnah Berurah that he wrote, Nohagim shahagabai omeid etzel sefer Torah. You ever wonder why there's a gabbai? I mean, we always say there's a gabbai to do the aliyahs. He says, Ya'amod this person and Mishaberach that person. But if you think about it, you don't need a gabbai. You can have the laner, if he knows what he's doing. He'll also lane and he can be the gabbai. Says the Chafetz Chaim, the gabbai is an important job. Not because he's the chief either flatterer or offender. You know that gabbaim can do either or, right? They can either flatter you by giving you an aliyah or tell you to open the ark, or God forbid, they can offend you by going ahead and not telling you to open the ark or give you an aliyah. Says the Chafetz Chaim, you know why you have a gabbai? You gimel, you should have 3 people. Hainu, and he explains, 1, the gabbai, whose job, as it were, is to stand in place of God, who calls out to the people. The gabbai says, just like God blew the shofar and indicated to the people to come to Mount Sinai. 2, the laner is the messenger in place of Moshe. And number 3, the one who gets the aliyah is on behalf of the Jewish people. So as you can see from these sources, not to lean, to make sure that there's at least 2 people at the bima, and according to the Chafetz Chaim 3, laning is not just about learning Torah. Had it been about learning Torah, all of these things wouldn't be on the screen. It's about creating an experience of receiving the Torah just like at Mount Sinai. So that every time we lane in shul, it's different than when we learn Torah at home. If you're sitting in your homes now, we're learning Torah together, I hope. In between my jokes, I hope we're learning Torah together. But when you're in shul, you're not just learning Torah, but together we're creating a Sinai experience. And this will explain why it's so important, according to Jewish law, that when you lane, there should be a minyan there. And without a minyan, you can, of course, open the Torah and learn from it, but you can't say the blessings that we usually say before and after. Because only with a minyan, with a congregation, can we re-experience the way it used to be at Sinai. Namely, there was all the Jewish people there. Now we have a representative of the Jewish people, 10 people. And we have a receiver of the Torah, a giver of the Torah, and someone that calls out to the people. And only when you have those 3 things can you create a living experience of the Sinai experience. So if I can sum up what I said until now, I basically said that we have to always look beyond routine. That means there's 1, the physical act of whatever mitzvah we're doing. And number 2, we have to ask, how does it influence me? What did it do for me? Not just, I'm tired because I shook the lulav, my hands hurt, or I walked to shul, my feet hurt, or I'm constipated because I ate too much matzah. And as you know, with 2 seders outside of Israel, it's a lot of matzah. Or I have a hangover because I drank 4 cups of wine, or I'm cold because I sat in the sukkah. It's also about, how did these things influence me, if at all? And I always think we have to look beyond routine and ask ourselves that question. And I just showed this evening how 2 of the mitzvot we do on a regular basis have both those aspects. Tefillin, the basic level, put it on your hand and on your head. But above and beyond the basic level, allow the mitzvot to influence your mind and your heart. And number 2, with laning, it's not just about learning Torah, which is a mitzvah in and of itself, but it's recreating an experience that excited the people way back when, and hopefully excites us today. And therefore, we don't just teach the Torah, we do it in a sing-song, and we make sure there's people at the bima, just like way back when. Now, I'm looking at Rabbi Friedman. I'm assuming that the synagogue is behind you as your virtual background. So I can't see the bima, but is the bima elevated or is it on floor level? It looks a bit elevated from here. Am I right?
It's on the floor. It's not raised in the shul.
But it's right in the middle there. And as I could
Yeah.
see, there's nothing around it.
Yeah, the other shul in Durban, it's elevated.
So as everybody here knows, it's very much based on what we said. If it's just about learning Torah, all you need is a lectern and you can read the Torah. But if you want to recreate the Sinai experience, then you have to have a quasi Mount Sinai. So you have a nice big bima there in the middle. It's elevated or not elevated like Mount Sinai, but as you know, Mount Sinai wasn't the highest mountain. So floor level is fine too. But obviously it's the centerpiece of any synagogue. And when you come in, even as I'm looking at Rabbi Friedman and behind him is virtual background, you can understand that the bima very much sticks out like the ark. If I have to look at the synagogue and I never been to a synagogue, I'd probably say, hey, what's the ark at the front and what's the bima in the middle? So I try to show this evening that we always have to look beyond routine and ask ourselves, how does the mitzvot influence us? Because if we don't ask that question, then unfortunately, we can become very good trained Jews doing everything right, but it would mean nothing to us. It would mean nothing to us and it wouldn't influence us. And I find that to be a terrible tragedy if that happens. And I'm going to give it to you in a small story. This is not a Hasidic story. This is a true story. How do I know it's a true story? Because it happened to me. I was coming back from being abroad for Pesach. I was a scholar in residence at a hotel, coming back to Israel the day after Pesach. And before COVID-19, the day after Pesach, the airport was extremely crowded. And I'm standing at passport control. And the gentleman goes in front of me, goes up to the passport, I forgot her name, officer, and says, "A good afternoon. How are you?" And it being Israel, the passport officer has an attitude and says to the fine gentleman, "You really care how I'm doing?" So the gentleman says, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "I've been away all Pesach. Now I'm going to be reunited with my family. For the last 8 days, I've been saying Hallel, the Thanksgiving prayer, thanking God for what was thousands of years ago. Every single day, blessing. God, you have commanded me to thank you for what happened thousands of years ago. Now, after going through that experience for 8 days, don't you think that I should at least thank you, Mrs. Passport Officer, for allowing me to be the conduit between outside of Israel and coming into Israel and being reunited with my family?" I have to admit, if it was any inspiration that I have to give the lectures and then write the book I did, it was that story. You say Hallel for 8 days, you should come out of that experience thanking everyone that's ever done a favor for you. Because if you thank God for something thousands of years ago, all the more so what's happening today. And that's what I believe could be a tragedy. If we just do the mitzvot without asking, how did it influence me? And there's no rules how it influences us. Each mitzvah can influence each individual differently than the person next to him. And therefore, indeed, I think that the most important thing is to just beg the question, how did it influence you? Put out the challenge, and I'm always interested in the answers. And allow me to conclude with the following. There was a great rabbi named Rav Shmuel Eliezer Halevi Adels. He died in 1631. He wrote 2 interpretations on the Talmud. One for the legal aspects of the Talmud, known as Chidushei Halachot, and the second for the stories, for the philosophical parts of the Talmud, known as Chidushei Agadot. If you ever open a tractate of Talmud, it's usually printed in the back. So you have the Maharsha, that's the name of the gentleman in abbreviation. The first part is the legalistic aspects, such as how you put on tefillin and whatnot. And the second is the stories of the Talmud, which he analyzes very, very nicely. In his introduction to his book, he did something that in the history of authors, no author has ever done. And that is that in the introduction to his own book, he says, "I made a terrible mistake. I made a terrible mistake. This whole interpretation that I wrote, and we're talking about all the tractates of Talmud, this is a lot. I made a huge mistake. What was my mistake? In the Talmud, the legalistic aspects and the more emotional ones are intertwined. They're on the same page. There's no difference between them. But when he wrote his interpretation, he divided. And he says, Uve'emet, hineni ro'eh, now I see. Shemichachmei Talmud shasu chibur echad mehalachot ve'agadot. They went ahead and they made one interpretation of called the oral Torah, documented in the Talmud. Ki Torah achat hilanu. Both the legalistic aspects, what we do with our hands and our feet and our mouth, and the more emotional aspects are all part of the same Torah. And I made a terrible mistake, he said. I divided them in my book that I just published. And therefore, he begs anyone that ever reads his interpretation, and I quote, don't divide between them, but rather see them both. Namely, don't go ahead and say, all right, that's the physical, it's more important. The physical is more important. Let's go now. Don't worry about the emotional. He says, no, they're all part of one Torah. They're all part of one experience of a Jew. And even though I made the mistake, he says to his readers, don't make the mistake. Give as much attention to every detail of how to fulfill Jewish law to how it influences you. Or, and I conclude with this, as we say many, many times, and it's even a beautiful song today. When Moshe Rabbeinu bids farewell to the Jewish people, he says, Ki karov elecha hadavar me'od beficha ubilvavecha la'asoto. What I just spoke about this evening is not impossible. It's very close to you. It's in your heart and your mouth to observe. With your mouth, what we say. Be it davening, laning, reading the Megillah, reading the Haggadah, ubilvavcha, how it influences you. I hope and pray that all of us will be able to fulfill this legacy of our great teacher Moshe, to both worship God with our hands, with our mouths, and at the same time, with our hearts as well. Thank you all very much for listening. You are a wonderful audience. If there's any questions and if there's time, with the permission of the rabbis, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Yishar koach, Rabbi Yehoshua, yishar koach. Any question? Anyone would like to ask a question? Now, in the meantime, before I ask Rabbi Tamar to say a few words on a different subject, or not on different subject, on this institution of Amiel, how are you handling these times as far as your mission is concerned?
So as you can see on the screen, I have the picture of where people go into the part of the airport down on the bottom here, where they have to show their passports and their boarding pass, meaning people that are not flying can't go through. I haven't seen it for 8 months. I usually saw it at least twice, if not 3 times in the same month. And that's our staff. We haven't been traveling. But in terms of our rabbis in the field, everyone is working very hard, as the rabbi knows very well. COVID-19 made us work harder, not easier. And thank God, as the skies open and as visas begin, people are beginning to assume positions. So since COVID-19 began, we've already sent a family to Athens, because Athens was open for a while, and we were able to send a family there. We're about to send families to Nairobi, to Manchester, to Rosario, Argentina, as well as to Malmo, Sweden. And as the saying goes, the more countries will open up, the more we'll be able to send to various countries. So I can definitely tell the rabbi that requests are coming in, CVs are being sent out, but in terms of the amount of people leaving, obviously it's much slower than a usual year.
I think now you've got Dubai and Oman on the list, I'm sure.
Absolutely, they're on the list. And I've already been approached, though informally, and we'll see what happens, God willing.
Rabbi Tamar, בבקשה. unmute. Rabbi Tamar, unmute.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much to Rav Yehoshua. As Rav Yehoshua was speaking about the experience of mitzvot, not just doing the mitzvah and just putting a check on that we fulfilled and did one of the commandments of Hashem, but also experience that mitzvah and having an influence on not just on that moment, but taking it to our lifestyle, if it's the family, if it's the community, or if it's even just the surroundings us. And when he was talking about experience, I was always thinking about, I'm sure only very few people here, Rabbi Zekri and Rav Yehoshua, know that before we came to South Africa, we had a very strong experience receiving our visa, where we needed to go to the South African embassy in Israel, in Ramat Gan, near Tel Aviv. I think it was 6 times. And every time we were going and something was missing, we need to get another authorization and another signature from someone else. But after that experience, maybe it's opposite what Rav Yehoshua was speaking about, but after that experience and we came to South Africa, I'm specifically for myself and Taged, we thank Rav Yehoshua for all the hard work, and not just from then, but also leading us and all the rabbis around the world, and the whole Amiel Strauss Institute, where they help us also, as he was speaking, also in halachic laws, but not less important of doing the law itself, also the emotional side, also the experience side, how we, by the way that we do it, we can also take it with us into our lives and have an influence on our souls, on our bodies, as he was talking about tefillin, about the brain and the heart, but also on our soul. And he gave only 2, because the time, he gave only 2 examples of tefillin and of tefillin, and the first one, and but I'm sure every single mitzvah has its influence and its experience. We just need to look for it. If it's lighting candles on Shabbat, now that we're coming to the Shabbat project, if it's lighting candles on Shabbat, if it's doing kiddush, so we're not just saying the words and drinking from the wine, but we have the family gathering together. We sing songs around the table. It's not just something that we sing songs. There's a meaning for singing songs and having the experience and dealing with the Shabbat and every single mitzvah that we have. So thank you very much, Rav Yehoshua. This very interesting shiur as experience also to our daily basis, weekly basis, to our community.
Thank you very much, Koach. Thank you very much. And once again, Yishar Koach, Rav Yehoshua. And please God, we will meet again.
Greatly looking forward to it.